So thank you for coming back again. We have now our founding speaker, Professor Rafal Pankowski. Next speaker, he's Professor of Sociology at Collegium Civitas in Warsaw, Poland. He's the author of the books New Fascism in Western Europe, A Study in Ideology, in 1998, Racism, Popular Culture, in 2006, and the populist radical right in Poland, the Patriots for Routledge in 2010. He's also co-founder of the Never Again Association, and Professor Pankowski was a visiting professor at the Center for European Studies of Chulalongkorn University, Bangkok, and the International Buddhist Studies College of a university with a very long name that I'm not able to pronounce, but it's in Ayutthaya in Thailand. He's a Rotary Peace Fellow at Makerere University in Kampala, Uganda too. So his talk today is has the title Japan as an Inspiration for Polish Nationalism in the First Half of the 20th Century. So thank you first.
Thank you very much. Once again, I'm very grateful for the invitation. It's a wonderful opportunity for me to participate in this fascinating conference in this very beautiful setting. Thank you. Well, let me start by stating that I refer to nationalism in a very broad sense here, which is a little bit different from the usual way we talk about nationalism in the Polish tradition of the history of ideas. I am going to refer to nationalism, including both progressive and reactionary movements and thinkers. Well, let me mention in the beginning that both Poland and Japan celebrate their Day of Constitution on the 3rd of May. This is highly symbolic as something that we have in common, but there is more than that. And in fact, Japan has played a very important role as a point of reference in Polish debates on national identity and state building, and especially in the context about debates on modernization. Now, let me just say something about the application of the idea or the prism of Orientalism in the Polish context. So as you know well, Orientalism, as described by Edward Said and others, amounts to an overtly stereotypical, essentialist perception and representation of the cultures of the East by the West. And the perception of Japan in Poland has been strongly filtered through the Orientalist lens. So a country in the Asian Far East, viewed from a country in East Central Europe, but Poland is a country with a very strong sense of identification with the culture and values of Western Europe. However, we also need to problematize the Orientalist relationship. In the course of the 20th century, in many ways, for Poland, Japan came to symbolize many Western values, values of capitalist modernization. At the same time, let's not forget that Poland has been the object of what we can call Orientalization too. So for many centuries, Poland itself has been viewed as a part of Europe's East rather than the West. So we can see that East and West tend to be relative and flexible and fluid categories. Now, the semi-peripheral status of Poland in the European context meant that for the last 2 centuries or so, the intellectual and political debates centered on the issue of modernization, as I mentioned already, So leaving behind the issue of underdevelopment and backwardness, and choosing the right path of modernization, the right model of modernization, has been a very key dilemma in Polish political and intellectual debates. And Japan, like I mentioned, really became a significant point of reference in those debates at several important points in Polish history, especially in the 20th century, and especially in the beginning of the 20th century, the early 900s, but again in the 1980s, when Lech Wałęsa, the leader of Solidarity movement in Poland, came up with the slogan, the idea of constructing a second Japan in Poland. That was a popular phrase at that time. So in the beginning of the 20th century, Poland was not an independent country, as I guess you know. It was divided, it was dominated by neighboring powers, Russia, Germany, and Austro-Hungary. But that provided, paradoxically, that provided plenty of room for political imagination. It provided room for imagining the future desired form of the state, and also there was room for debates about possible models of the future Polish state. And the Japanese case, as a point of reference, comes very much into play here in the first years of the 20th century. So the Japanese social, political, and economic model played an important role as a point of reference throughout the 20th century. I don't want to present all the material I have here, but let me just mention some of those historical junctures, some of those debates, and also some of the participants in those debates. So, of course, for good reasons, the Russian-Japanese War has been mentioned many times for the last 2 days, and of course that was a very important juncture in those Polish political discussions, with repercussions ever since. So to give you one example, I think it's a phrase that says a lot. It's a phrase written by Wiesław Górnicki, who remarked paradoxically, I quote, "For us, Poles, Japan is almost a neighboring country," end of quote. And when he wrote that phrase, of course, this formulation means that both countries are neighbors with Russia, with all the challenges that come with that. And he wrote it in the context of his reflections about the Russian-Japanese War, which at that time, in 1904, awoke Polish hopes for weakening, the weakening of the Russian imperial power, the Japanese victory, and it reignited Polish aspirations for independence. So the Polish public opinion in that period was very enthusiastic about the Japanese success in the war against Russia. Now Górnicki, the author of the phrase about Poland and Japan as neighboring countries, he was in the 1980s a key advisor to the Polish communist dictator General Wojciech Jaruzelski. And with Jaruzelski, he went to Japan on an official visit, and he wrote a speech that Jaruzelski was supposed to deliver at a reception in the imperial palace, Akasaka. But when Jaruzelski read the draft speech with the references to the Polish and Japanese links, historical links, he became very upset and he called Górnicki at 4 a.m. to his hotel room and told him to rewrite the speech, because he said, according to Górnicki's account, I quote, so Jaruzelski said to Górnicki, I quote, "Do you want to create an impression of a Polish-Japanese brotherhood of arms? I am surprised by your naivety. The journalists will write that I referred to a common struggle of the Poles and the Japanese against Russia. They won't notice anything else." End of quote. So still in the 1980s, a reference to the Russian-Japanese war by a Polish leader would have been seen as a political provocation in the eyes of the Soviet officials. So they had to change that part of the speech. But let me stress again that the Polish interest in Japan, that went beyond the geopolitical factors. So it really went beyond just perceiving Japan as a potential ally against Russia. There was a real upsurge in Polish interest in Japanese politics and culture, which accompanied the rise of Japanese power and peaked in the first decade of the 20th century, and it was reflected by publications in the Polish press. And Japan was presented as a positive model of social and political reforms. In 1904, Inazo Nitobe's book, Bushido, The Soul of Japan, was translated into Polish and published in the majority Polish city of Lviv, now in Western Ukraine. Nitobe himself visited Poland during his European tour, and he wrote a preface to the book's Polish edition, in which he attempted to relate traditional Japanese vocabulary to the Polish tradition. And I think Oleg actually mentioned something very, very similar in terms of trying to relate the Japanese vocabulary from that book to the English audience, and apparently it was a very sort of similar approach I have here. So I can quote from the preface to the Polish edition by Nitobe. Daimyo and samurai will reveal their meaning to the Polish readers when we will compare them to the Polish kasztelan and starosta, old Polish words which represent the sort of Polish tradition of the 17th century. So that book was a big success among the Polish audience. According to a Polish historian, Robert Gembel, I quote, "It excited and ignited the minds of the Polish nationalists in the beginning of the 20th century." End of quote. In 1905, another important book about Japan was published in Polish translation. That was Okakura Kakuzo's The Awakening of Japan, translated from English by Maria Venclova. And I actually brought my copy. It's a very precious book in my collection, and it's also interesting to read the preface, which was written by the translator, the Polish translator, who wrote, I quote, "The strength and development of Japan, which has so strongly manifested itself in recent times, undoubtedly result from learning the civilization and science of the West. However, as a moral force, a strength of characters displayed by outstanding representatives of the nation and even by simple soldiers, it has resulted from the mix of the doctrines of Confucius and of the Buddha." End of quote. And then, all of a sudden, alluding to Poland's own situation and potential, Maria Venclova wrote, I quote, "We, Poland, we have a rich treasure of that kind of strength. Those treasures are available for the simple man even in our national customs, traditions, and faith. One just needs to study them, love them, and implement them," end of quote. So a publication of this book about Japan was in fact intended as a tool towards affirming Polish identity and Polish patriotic sentiments more than anything else. Now, I'm not sure you can see this picture clearly, but it represents a very interesting and symbolic meeting between two Polish leaders and political thinkers, Józef Piłsudski on the left and Roman Dmowski on the right side. Until today, those two figures represent different models of Polish national identity. Józef Piłsudski represents what we can call a civic model of national identity. Roman Dmowski represents what we may call the ethno-nationalist model of identity. And until today, those rival visions of what it means to be Polish, rival visions of Polishness dominate the Polish debates. In 1904, both those two rival leaders simultaneously traveled to Japan, to Tokyo, where they promoted their competing visions of the Polish-Japanese relationship, but also competing visions of Poland. Józef Piłsudski, on the left side, he was the leader of the Polish Socialist Party at that time, which sought a breakup of the Russian Empire. And Piłsudski looked for Japanese help in organizing an uprising against the Russian forces in Poland. And he proposed to organize a Polish legion fighting on the Japanese side, composed of Polish conscripts from the Russian army. Those negotiations also took place in Europe, in London, and those negotiations were directly supervised by the Imperial Minister of Foreign Affairs, Komura Yutaro. And as a result of those talks, Piłsudski and the delegation of the Polish Socialist Party, they were invited to Japan for negotiations by the deputy chief of the Japanese General Staff, General Kodama Gentaro. Now, like I mentioned, at the same time, Roman Dmowski also traveled to Tokyo to discourage the Japanese from giving any help to Piłsudski. And guess what? They accidentally bumped into each other in the street in Tokyo. And they actually agreed, for the first and only time ever, they agreed to sit down and talk. And they actually spent a day together talking about what they were trying to achieve in Tokyo, but also talking about the rival visions of Polish identity and Poland's future. This conversation took place in Tokyo on the 13th of July, 1904. They didn't reach any agreement. They came back to Poland and stayed bitter rivals until the end. I was actually lucky to visit the restaurant in Tokyo where that meeting took place. It's still there. So in the end, the Japanese government did not decide to give full support to the idea proposed by Piłsudski, but they gave some support and some funding, and also some training to the Polish Socialist Party. And it's a fun fact, it's an interesting fact that apparently 4 of the future prime ministers of Poland went through those trainings by the Japanese intelligence. Those trainings took place in Switzerland before World War I. Okay, but it is clear that Dmowski also took something from Japan. Namely, he got a lot of inspiration that he talked about and wrote about in the years to come, or in fact in decades to come, as he himself increasingly shifted towards fascism. He actually invoked the Japanese example as a positive inspiration, and especially in his notorious book published in 1933, The Breakthrough, he wrote, for example, I quote, "The current center of energy of this world, Japan, today represents the most independent and most active political power." So it was a very, very positive reference and a positive image of Japan that he promoted ever since he visited Tokyo. Okay, I'm skipping some other examples, but let me mention another interesting figure. This is Bronisław Piłsudski, who was actually the elder brother of Józef Piłsudski. Józef Piłsudski is considered the father of the nation in Poland today. Bronisław Piłsudski is not so well known, both inside of Poland and outside of Poland, but he's a really interesting character with a very interesting biography. So he was a student in St. Petersburg, and he was implicated in a plot to kill the Tsar, Alexander III. He was arrested and initially sentenced to death. His sentence was commuted to 15 years of hard labor in the Sakhalin. It was the same plot in which Lenin's brother was implicated too, and he was actually hanged. So after 15 years in the Far East, Bronisław Piłsudski became a self-made, a self-taught researcher and advocate for the Ainu minority culture in Russia and in Japan. And this is a picture showing Piłsudski with Ainu children. He also established a family. He married an Ainu woman. He had children. Then, after some years, after a spell in Tokyo, he eventually returned to Europe in 1905. Settled first in Krakow, then in Switzerland, and then Paris, where he worked for the Polish National Committee. And he died just a few months before Poland finally regained independence in 1918, possibly by suicide. Now, I believe what Bronisław Piłsudski deserves is a serious recognition for his legacy as an anthropologist and ethnographer. In the 1900s, he authored numerous articles about the Ainu, but also about Japan in general. Including an optimistic assessment of the modernizing process, leading, in his views, towards a democratic future for Japan. Let me quote from one of those articles. "The times are changing. The old authorities are falling down. Japan is entering a new era when the exercise of state power will pass into the hands of a generation brought up and educated in the ideals of a more democratic Europe. End of quote. And once again, I think here we can see that this statement was probably a reflection of what Bronisław Piłsudski hoped for his own country, for Poland, rather than an objective assessment of Japan and Japan's future. Okay, I mentioned he was a self-taught anthropologist and ethnographer, and he was also a pioneer of the method of participant observation. He fully immersed himself in the Ainu community and Ainu culture. I already mentioned the family, and his approach to the Ainu was really characterized by a deep empathy and a radical commitment to the well-being and emancipation of that community. When he finally returned to Poland, he met a young student from Krakow with whom he shared his experiences and his methodology. The name may sound familiar to you. The name of the student was Bronisław Malinowski. I think it's an interesting detail about the history of the emergence of social anthropology. And of course, Malinowski gets all the credit rather than Bronisław Piłsudski. Okay, one more person I want to mention, one more author is Wacław Sieroszewski, whose biography in some ways resembles Bronisław Piłsudski. So he was also a Polish revolutionary, a socialist activist who was arrested and imprisoned in the Russian Far East twice. I think in total he spent more than 10 years as a prisoner in the Far East. And eventually returned to Poland. In 1914, he joined the Polish military units, the Legion, led by Józef Piłsudski, which fought against Russia on the side of Austro-Hungary. Here in this picture, it is Wacław Sieroszewski on the left, and the man on the right is Józef Piłsudski, who I mentioned in the beginning. You can see that Sieroszewski was not a young man anymore. I think he was in his 60s already. In 1918, as a leader of the National Independence Party, he became the Minister of Information and Propaganda in the newly formed provisional government of the Republic of Poland. And in the 20s and 1930s, he remained one of the most respected members of the Polish literary and political establishment, a member of the Senate, the chairman of the Polish Writers' Union, and so on. At the same time, Sieroszewski constantly returned to the imagery and reality of the Far East, including Japan, where he also accompanied Bronisław Piłsudski on his research in the Ainu community, but also in Tokyo. To give you an example of some titles of the books written and published by Sieroszewski in that period, Love and Death, Stories from Japan, In the Far East, On the Volcanoes of Japan, The Love of the Samurai, and so on. There is a Polish literary scholar, Zdzisław Kempf, who in the 1980s wrote an analysis of the literary output of Wacław Sieroszewski, and he came to a sort of provocative conclusion, which I also want to mention. He said that due to the predominance of the Japanese references, symbolism, and philosophy at the heart of his novels, Sieroszewski could be perceived not as a Polish writer writing about Japan, but as a Japanese writer writing in Polish, which I thought was a curious kind of interpretation. So again, we have an illustration of the very profound importance and influence of the Japanese the Japanese cultural influence on one of the main Polish cultural figures of the first decades of the 20th century. Okay, one more example. Aleksander Janta Połczyński, who was, I think we can call him the Forrest Gump of the 1930s. He was a young journalist from Poland who met everybody and interviewed everybody who was anybody in the world in the 1920s and the 30s. It's a long list of figures he interviewed and friends he made, including Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Charlie Chaplin, Josephine Baker, Thomas Mann, Mahatma Gandhi, Rabindranath Tagore, Haile Selassie, Bao Dai, the emperor of Annam, Vietnam, Puyi, the former emperor of China and leader of Manchuria. And Janta Połczyński spent a big part of the decade in 1930s traveling across East Asia and several years in the 1930s. For several years he served as the correspondent of the Polish newspaper Gazeta Polska in Tokyo. There is a picture I forgot to bring, but I remember it well. It is the picture of Janta Połczyński, still just a young journalist, with the entire imperial cabinet of ministers of Japan, which was interesting to note. Now, Aleksander Janta Połczyński, among his friends, also counted a certain German correspondent to Tokyo. Again, the name may ring a bell. His name was Richard Sorge, who played an interesting historical role later on during the war. Janta also traveled to the Sakhalin, searching the traces of Bronisław Piłsudski, and managed to meet with members of the still existing Polish community in that region. As you may imagine, also in the case of Aleksander Janta Połczyński, Japan had a profound influence on him as a journalist and a poet, who was especially inspired by Japanese Buddhism and the aesthetics of Japanese art. He wrote several books, such as Made in Japan. This is one of the covers. In 1939, Janta published his translations of short stories of the 17th century Japanese author Ihara Saikaku, and other books and collections of Japanese poetry. He actually made sure that the translations of Japanese poetry he published in Poland were printed on a special kind of Japanese paper that he imported from Japan. So Janta Połczyński is interesting also in the sense that his embrace of Japanese culture was very different to what I told you about Roman Dmowski, who was enthusiastic about the Japanese model because he thought that would fit with his fascist model. In the case of Jan Tapolczyński, it was his fascination with Japan and Japanese culture was in line with his principled anti-racist and anti-fascist and humanist stance, and his commitment to what we can call today intercultural dialogue and understanding. In 1939 until 1945, Jan Tapolczyński fought against the Nazis as a member of the Polish armed forces and resistance movements on several fronts of World War II. After the war, he settled in the US, where he died in 1974. His widow died just a few years ago. Now, one more example, again, showing someone from a radically different side of the political ideological spectrum is Maximilian Maria Kolbe, who was a Polish Catholic priest, a member of the Franciscan order, who became well known for his role in building Polish Catholic media in Poland, using modern technology, mass circulation newspapers as well as radio. And his media empire in Poland had many characteristic features of the Catholic Church in Poland in the 20s and the 30s, including authoritarianism, anti-liberalism, anti-Semitism, conspiracy theories, and the general rejection of social diversity. In 1930, he left Poland with an ambition to establish an international missionary operation in Asia, first in China, then in Japan. He created a small monastery in Nagasaki, which is still standing. But overall, the operation was not very successful. As we know, he was not the first Christian missionary who unsuccessfully attempted to baptize Japan. He returned to Poland in 1936. And in 1940, he was arrested by the Nazis during the Nazi German occupation of Poland as part of repressions against the Catholic clergy in Poland, and he was sent to Auschwitz, where he died on the 14th of August 1941. He was canonized as a saint of the Catholic Church by Pope John Paul II in 1982. And I think in many ways Kolbe today can be considered as a symbolic figure, a protagonist, as well as a victim of the intolerant ideologies of the first half of the 20th century. But one interesting aspect of the last months and weeks of the life of Maximilian Maria Kolbe, when he was imprisoned in Auschwitz, according to accounts of survivors, he provided consolation to fellow prisoners, inmates in the camp, by telling them about his experiences of Japan and telling them about Japanese customs and culture, a form of imaginary escape from the cruel reality of violence and starvation at the camp in Auschwitz. So to summarize, I just wanted to tell you that through some of those examples and there are more examples that I didn't try to present. The interest, the vivid interest in Japanese politics and culture was really widespread in Poland in the first decades of the 20th century. Those champions of the Polish interest in Japan, they came from diverse walks of life and political ideological orientations from across the spectrum, the left and right. In some cases, the interest was really rooted in the experience of extensive travel and deep knowledge of the culture of the Far East and Japan. But when it comes to the general public, we may suspect that the knowledge about Japan was at best very superficial. And it seems that the debates about the modernization of Japanese society mostly reflected Poland's own debates and controversies about an appropriate strategy for national modernization, balancing the requirements of modernity with tradition. So in Poland at that time, the key debates revolved around issues of modernization and nationalism, and Japan in this context was presented and quoted as an example of successful modernization, where Western and Eastern values coexisted in a supposedly harmonious manner. So in this sense, the Polish discourses about Japan in the first half of the 20th century tend to tell us much more about Poland than about Japan. Those diverse Polish perspectives on the Japanese model provide a mirror in which different visions of national identity were reflected and played out. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Professor Pankowski, for this very interesting talk. So I would immediately give the microphone to the floor.
Thank you very much for this very interesting talk. I would like to ask you whether you know of any contemporary attempt to republish some of the books written by, for instance, Wacław Sieroszewski and Alexander Janta Bołczowski.
Thank you. Well, both of them were very prolific, so there are many, many books, each of them authored. I know some contemporary editions exist, but I think most of that output was never republished after 1945. Well, I think Sieroszewski is better known today than Jan Bołczowski. And there are also collected works of Sieroszewski that were published in Poland, I guess in the 60s. But none of them today is a household name, in the sense that, let's say, Piłsudski and Dmowski are, of course, household names. But I guess we can now talk about some more contemporary issues. I told you about the second peak of the Polish interest in Japan was in the 1980s. I think since then it has decreased again for a lot of different reasons that are a little bit outside of the scope of this conversation. But I think because of that also those books are not so popular nowadays. They are just not so well known, and there are few contemporary editions, which I regret.
Yeah. So again, thank you for the very interesting talk, and this question of Poland using Japan as a model for modernization, Japan as sort of an ideal type of modernity. You were talking a lot about what's happening in sort of the early 20th century, but I'm wondering what that looks like in the context of the 1930s. So the Manchurian incident, Japan's political trajectory in the 1930s. What do Polish intellectuals and political figures think about Japan's turn once we get into the early 1930s?
Okay. Well, thank you. Like you saw, I skipped some of the material I have here because I didn't want to talk too much, but yes, okay. I think again we have those two main approaches. Yes, one I think is symbolized by Jan Pałczyński, who was actually in Tokyo in the 30s. He lived there and he wrote about what he saw, but he was very much a Polish sort of liberal intellectual. And he loved Japan. There was not a lot of criticism of Japan in his writing in the 30s, maybe surprisingly. But he had a very sort of positive image of Japan. He edited a special edition of Wiadomości Literackie. Wiadomości Literackie was the main cultural, literary weekly of the progressive intelligentsia in Poland, so they devoted a whole issue to Japan in 1937, I think, and Jan Pałczyński was the editor. So we have this angle, and on the other side, we have Roman Dmowski, who referred to Japan also in a very positive way, but in a very different style, because he thought, well, this is a great model because it represents the model of what we may call fascist modernization, which is what he approved of, and he wanted this for Poland. So again, I think once more, depending on the ideological background, different authors saw in Japan what they chose to see. And sorry, you referred to Manchuria. Yes, Jan Pałczyński also traveled there. There was still a substantial Polish community in Harbin at that time. If you are interested in the history of spies, there was a lot of activity of Polish intelligence working partly with Japanese or other operatives. But it's a different story. I would say it's rather outside of the intellectual history of the period. But I think actually some of the links that were established between the Polish Socialist Party and Józef Piłsudski around 1904, they continued well into the 1930s and even 1940s, when Poland and Japan were actually technically at war. But in practice, there was still some cooperation in some surprising ways. Apparently, some members of the Polish resistance actually used the Japanese embassy in Berlin to send messages, which is a rather surprising kind of constellation, but apparently that was still possible at the time, thanks to some less than obvious cooperations and connections that existed. Well, Józef Piłsudski famously said that he left the red tram on the Stop Independence, meaning these were former socialists with different degrees of nostalgia for their socialist youth.
Yeah, thank you very much for an interesting introduction to the Polish perception of Japan. This self-identification with Japan, what does that mean for the role of Orientalism? So is Japan already de-Orientalized in the perception in Poland, or is the Polish self-perception an Orientalized one, and therefore Japan is something like a positive example how to break this kind of position and self-occidentalize, to take up some of the terms we have used before. So where would you put it in the matrix of Orientalism and Occidentalism, maybe?
Thank you for this question. I think I understand your question, and I think it's a very appropriate question in the context of what we heard also earlier in the different country contexts. And I think there is no simple answer here in the Polish case, largely because Poland's own position in this whole Orientalist debate has been rather uncertain and a little bit fluid and really depended on a time as well as the ideological background of this or that author or protagonist. And when I heard about Spain and Morocco in the context of Orientalism, I thought, okay, maybe I should be talking about Poland and Turkey, because historically Turkey was the sort of neighbor that Poland related to in the context of the Orient. But also Turkey had a big influence on the Ottoman, let's be precise. Ottoman culture had a big impact on Polish culture, especially around the 17th century. If you see, portraits of the Polish gentry or Polish kings such as Jan Sobieski, the national dress of Poland was basically the Ottoman dress. So Poland also traveled between East and West quite a lot throughout history. And I think the relationship to the Far East is a little bit complex, partly because of that. Because maybe Poland, in some ways, sometimes also has been part of the East rather than the West. Therefore, this classification is far from fixed. Maybe it's not a very straightforward answer, but I hope it is an answer.
Yes, just a follow-up answer to, or question actually, of what we heard before. I was wondering, you mentioned one of the translations of in Polish of Japanese books written in English, like not only Bushido but also Okakura, Kakuzo, or Tenshin's Awakening of Asia, I think. And I was wondering if that position of Japan as a hybrid, or the country who has somehow managed to take the best from the so-called West and from the so-called East, which was Asia in his case, was resonating in a specific way also on all the following scholars or intellectuals that you've mentioned, because you have a structured representation to say, okay, they were taking Japan as a kind of model for their specific kind of nationalism or national identity. I was wondering if this idea, hybrid idea, or what I've called yesterday, quoting Iwabuchi Koichi, strategic hybridism, to position yourself between this essentialized pole of the West and the essentialized pole of the East, was a factor also for, let's say, Polish nationalism or Polish nationalism influenced by some ideas coming from Japan. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I honestly couldn't have put it better. So I appreciate this comment. I think this is exactly what they were trying to do. Whether they succeeded in making it convincing, I'm not too sure, but I think this is precisely the approach they had. So trying to modernize a nation while preserving the tradition, but also embracing the modernity, but in a certain way with reservations, also respecting the social hierarchy and religion and so on. So I think that the hybrid was the model those Polish authors aspired to. So using Japan as an example, but they were really talking about Poland more than about Japan itself. Yes. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you again for this enlightening presentation. I have two comments which are, and a question, which are not specifically for Poland, but maybe Poland is a quintessential example of a country near Russia or the Soviet Union later, that the attitude to Japan is very much not because it's Japan, but because it's a neighbor opposing your enemy in a sense. And it goes from the Russo-Japanese world and the years of World War II as well. And remains even later to these days, this kind of animosity to Russia that somehow related to Japan. At the same time, there is I wonder also about the historiography. And often in countries where historians, and I would try to be cautious about it, are dealing mainly with the relation of their country to Japan or to any country. I mean, that's the main contribution to the general historiography. At the same time, in a way, also representing their own country. So they are usually in kind of emphasizing the positive sides of the relations. So much of what is written about Polish-Japanese relations is somehow praising the relation while somehow hiding, masking the problematic aspects. Mm-hmm. So getting back to the problematic aspects, side by side with the positive admiration, collaboration with Japan from 1904 to 1945, even later, wasn't there some Orientalistic opinion about Japan that somehow infiltrated via, for example, French literature, English literature, and they are there but often kind of remain hidden. Have you seen anything of these kind of more Western Orientalistic approach to Japan during this period? Thank you.
Thank you. No, that's a valid point. That's a valid point. I cannot think of an example right now, but I'm sure we could find them. Perhaps not necessarily about Japan or only about Japan, but let's say more broadly about Asia or the Far East. I'm sure we could find them both historically and in contemporary public discourse. Oh, there is a lot. Oh, there is plenty. Oh, yes, totally, totally, absolutely. You are right. Absolutely, you are right. Well, I just thought that Father Kolbe that I mentioned, he was generally sympathetic towards Japan. Originally, he wanted to establish his mission in China, but there was war in China in the 30s, so he changed his mind and moved to Nagasaki because he thought Nagasaki is the safest place there could be, and as we know, he was wrong. But he was also critical of the basic facts about Japan, namely it was not Christian Catholic. But the main enemies he saw in Japan were Protestants. that were the main problem for them. There were too many Protestants in Japan that he was complaining about. I can actually quote a short passage from what he wrote in Nagasaki in 1934. No, sorry, it was not Kolbe, it was one of his helpers, one of his assistants, also from Poland. I quote, Observing the religious movement of the local society, one has the impression that day of salvation for Japan is approaching. The religion of the cult of forefathers is visibly losing its supporters, especially the intelligentsia tends to accept the Christian religion, although they usually do not differentiate between the Catholics and the Protestants. The Protestants are harming Christ's idea through their false teachings and the non-Christian way of life. Despite everything, the dawn is appearing over Japan. Virgin Mary is taking this noble nation under her protection. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. We are running out of time. Thank you so much, Professor Pankowski. And so we are moving to the next speaker. Thank you very much. Yes.